What's up, my fellow emo, pop punk, metalcore music lovers? Matrix here, and you are locked into the Matrix Music Review Podcast, the only place to get your alt-rock music fix. And we are back. Yes, it has been a while. I apologize. I ended up getting sick and losing my voice for a while there, and it's still not back to 100%. It's not as strong as I'd like it to be, but we got to get some content out here for you guys. I love doing this, and I can't wait to talk about some of these albums and tours and all these different things that I've been doing, even with my bum voice. So bear with me. I might be a little slower, or it might not sound as great, but I definitely want to get this stuff out there for you guys because I got a lot to talk about. We're actually going to break these podcasts up into two. This first one is all about the heavy hardcore side of the music scene that I've been listening to. Knocked Loose, like Moths to Flames, bands like that have all released new albums recently and that have been kind of taking off around the scene. And then in the second one, we're going to get into some of the more metalcore standard stuff that I usually listen to. Bring Me the Horizon's new album, which I know everybody wants to hear about, and some of the other new tracks and songs that I've been listening to as well. As always, every link that you need is in the description here. I'm actually linking them now as opposed to just putting in Twitter, Instagram, whatever. You guys will have links down there so you can easily follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at Matrix Music Review. Instagram's where I am most active. I've been posting a bunch of tours since apparently that's all we do anymore is announce tours that apparently I need to go to because everything's coming in my area. But I love that. I love getting out to shows and even meeting up with some of you guys, which has been fun to do as well. If you're listening on Apple Music or Spotify, leave a 5-star review. Let me know how I'm doing. Also, let me know if there's anything I missed. God knows that it's been, I feel like, a month since we've talked, and there's been a ton of albums that have come out, so I'm bound to have missed one or bound to have missed a new artist that maybe I didn't pick up on. Let me know who I should be listening to, and I'll be sure to check it out and put it on a pod next time. And as I always do, make sure that you are sharing this podcast with friends, families, coworkers, anybody that might be looking for a new podcast or looking to get into alternative music. Send them me their way so that they can get up to date on what is hot in the alt-rock scene. And with that, we are jumping right into reviews, and we're starting with Coup de Grace by SeeYouSpaceCowboy. So this is a 12-song album, and this album is beautiful, and it is beautifully constructed from head to toe, and it starts with a song, Allow Us to Set the Scene, and basically that's exactly what it does. It sets the scene beautifully, and Iris EXE does such a beautiful job on this album in a couple of different tracks with just this almost poetry, soothing, spoken word way that she really just allows you to kind of sink even deeper into this album. And Allow Us to Set the Scene really starts with this slow, soothing sound, almost an orchestral background, and then it just blasts into what SeeYouSpaceCowboy does best. And it blasts you into a song like Subtle Whispers, which really does display the range that this band has. And I think my biggest takeaway from this album is that there's no mistaking when a SeeYouSpaceCowboy song comes on. There's no mistaking this band. They are potentially the most unique band out in the scene right now. They are not doing it like anybody else. Nobody else is doing it like them, and this works so perfectly well. There's such a variety of vocal deliveries on this album between Connie and the other band members that there's always something new that you're getting in a song. It's not the same vocal delivery. It's not even the same person delivering vocals in each track, and I think that's what really stood out and made this album so much fun to listen to. And the production behind these songs is so good as well. You know, in a song like Red Wine and Discontent, that really shows the standout nature. And it even has some lines in it too. I mean, lyrically, I didn't dig too deep into this, but Red Wine and Discontent has lines like, if I'm so helpless, then you're so romantic. And you just need to stay buried in your secrets. And it's all those relatable little things that kind of just make your ears perk up and say, okay, like, obviously SeeYouSpaceCowboy is a band that I can relate to and something that I can relate with. and it just helps you get into the album even more. I mean, this album is one that I definitely felt like was a fully immersive experience. It was hard not to find myself kind of just engrossed in this album and just enjoying every last second of it. And I think that feeling on this album is because of the album construction. You know, obviously we started out with that Iris EXE feature, and there's some spoken word in here, and there's features throughout that keep your attention. I mean, obviously the Courtney LaPlante feature is massive, but even when we have like that middle point with Iris EXE doing another little spoken word spot, it is kind of just a nice breather to get you back and kind of bring you back into the album, even though you really haven't gone anywhere. It just kind of like refocuses your attention to everything. And I think that's really what is going to end this review. I mean, this album was spectacular from start to finish. I think you guys know by now that, you know, I haven't really been deep into the hardcore scene as much as maybe some other people, or even, you know, just getting back into the alternative scene. But as I've started to dip my toe back in, SeeYouSpaceCowboy has been a band that I've really been drawn to. And I am so happy with this album. This album's going to get a 9.1 out of 10 for me. And it's just going to continue to rise. It's one that I keep going back to, you know, a month later. And I can't wait to see where SeeYouSpaceCowboy goes from here. I know that they're going to be in my area soon. I'm going to try and get out and check them out. But if you haven't heard it yet, go check out Coup de Grace by SeeYouSpaceCowboy. Next up is You Won't Go Before You're Supposed To by Knocked Loose. I think at this point, when you discuss Knocked Loose, it's hard not to consider them potentially the top band in the hardcore scene right now. I'm not saying that they're the best or they're the most historical or whatever you want to call it, but I think Knocked Loose really is the hottest band in the hardcore scene right now. And it starts right away in this album. The production on Thirst, there's a spot at 48 seconds, I think, is around where this production spot is, which almost sounds like a old Game Boy starting up when you click the on-off switch and you hear that sound. Just listen to the Thirst and listen to that spot and tell me it doesn't sound exactly like that. And Knocked Loose is definitely the heaviest I've gone on this podcast. I think I've dipped my toe into metalcore, and there's always been some melodic pieces to the albums that I've reviewed. Not so much with Knocked Loose. I think this album from start to finish is nothing but hardcore screams and just heavy, heavy vocals and music behind it all. And so with that in mind, it definitely took a little bit of a different mindset for me as a reviewer to kind of set the stage for myself to really listen to this album. I had to think more about the stylistic choices and the way the screams were done. It's not just so much focusing on the melodic versus the screaming and the blend of it all. When you have all screaming, it definitely is a little bit of a different mindset that I've had going into this. But the energy that Knocked Loose came with on this album is unreal. And I feel like sometimes that's a little bit of a cop-out, right? Like, obviously, when you have a band like Knocked Loose or even hardcore bands, energy is going to be a big thing. And I feel like that's the wrong word to use, is energy. And that's why I wanted to mention that ahead of time, is that, you know, I feel like if you're a reviewer and you say that Knocked Loose is energetic, that's just such a cop-out. But unfortunately, I can't think of the word of what I want to use here. So we're just going to go with that, and I'm sure I'm going to get blasted for it. But Knocked Loose with that Poppy collab is what really kind of captured my attention right away. And speaking of heavy on this album, Don't Reach For Me is beyond the definition of heavy. I mean, this fucking track is all about how lies can kill you, and it's why your daughter left, and how this is such a fitting end for such a fucking clown, and all these different lines. I mean, I actually looked at some of the lyrics of this track because I was like, maybe I'm hearing this wrong. Maybe I'm not picking up on it. Obviously, I'm not big into screams. Maybe I'm missing it. And I wasn't. And that is just insane. And it's something that I don't know that I expected to like as much as I did, but damn, I really did enjoy the heaviness of a track like Don't Reach For Me. But I think there's also a artistic expression that Knocked Loose has that may go unnoticed because of how heavy they are. There are some subtle production choices that add so much to these tracks that make it so interesting to look at. You have these like minor stick claps from the drums. You have this almost like Wild West outro on one of the tracks. And I say Wild West, but it's really just like an old school 40s, 50s style music track that leads out. And it's just those subtle little things that really just capture attention and show that it's not just all of the screams and the energy and the knocked loose motherfuckers that are going to stand out. It's other little things that they actually take time to pay attention to. And that's what really stood out as well to me. And I think the last thing I just want to touch on is that Slaughterhouse 2 on here, I went back and listened to Slaughterhouse 1. I had listened to it when it first came out. And I think this is exactly what you would expect from a track like this, especially with Motionless on there. So I don't think there's much that I need to talk to about this. So I think overall this album was really fun. It was a good time to get into some hardcore music. I think if you are somebody like me that maybe you really haven't jumped into that hardcore side as much, try Knocked Loose and see what happens. I mean, I know it's kind of a being thrown into the deep end, but I think it's definitely worth it. And I think if you give it a chance, you really will like it. For me, this album was an 8.5 out of 10, and that's just based off of initial reactions. I think this is one, again, that can really, I can see it kind of rising up my board and being one of my favorites by the end of the year. So if you haven't heard it yet, go check out You Won't Go Before You're Supposed To by Knocked Loose. Next album is The Cycles of Trying to Cope by Like Moths to Flames. This is the 6th album from Like Moths to Flames, and I can honestly say that I have absolutely no recollection of their album from 2020. I have no recollection of it whatsoever. I even went back and listened to it, and I don't remember any of it. So I'm not really sure why or where that came from, but I have no recollection of that damn album. And this album is definitely much more wordy than the previous 2 albums that I've reviewed on the podcast. There are definitely more lines. There's definitely more that you can really take from these songs. And I don't really know the right way to explain that, but there's more that comes out of the lyrics in this album than does on some of the other ones that I've already talked about. Over the Garden Wall is where I really got into this album. It took me a little bit to get into it, but that track is really what started it for me. And I think it's one of those things with this album that because it was such a heavy music time, that this album really did take a little bit to get used to. And this album was just strange for me. I mean, there were some weirdly religious tones to it. I mean, obviously there are some song titles that make that connection make sense, but honestly, this album is just one that I just can't really get a full grasp of. I think Kintsugi was another one that stood out to me, and it was a favorite. It's just this emotional, introspective track that's really all about taking a look at yourself and thinking about yourself. But overall, I'm not going to talk too much about this album because I can't really give it a complete rating. I liked it, but there's really not much I can say about it. Unfortunately, this was one of those heavy albums that I just couldn't pull it all together. I mean, like I said, I got into it on Over the Garden Wall, and then it just kind of teetered back and forth. I kind of lost some interest, but it wasn't because the album was bad. It was just because there's been a lot of heavy music, and sometimes I can't do all heavy all at the same time. So This is going to be an incomplete rating. I'm not going to give it a full one. If I had to, I'd probably be a 7.5, 8 out of 10. But I don't think it's fair to give it a full rating without actually going into it a little bit more. So if you want to hear more on it, let me know. But for right now, we're going to stick with that and just give it a very basic, generic review. The next album up is The Mosaic by Capstan. So this is Capstan's 5th album, and this one was all over the place for me. I'm not going to lie. This was an album that I had really high hopes for. I actually saw them live the Wednesday before this album dropped and was super impressed with them. And they had such a connection with the crowd. I had such a connection right there. And then when I listened to this album, the connection wasn't there. And I'm wondering if maybe, sometimes that happens. Sometimes you see bands live and they have a bigger connection with you than you do when you listen to them. And maybe that's what this was. But the album itself definitely did not connect with me as much as I would have liked it to. And I think the standout on this album was Undertow and kind of that flow into An Open Letter, which was such an interesting addition. It was almost an acoustic track, but even though it was acoustic, it was almost as if you were getting a recording of a recording, if that makes sense. Like, we didn't get the traditional acoustic sound. It was almost just like somebody recorded it on their phone and you were getting the playback in your ear that way. And it's just such a variety of sounds on this album. I mean, not every song is the same. You have a really funky beat on a song like What You Want. You have Arrows, which is probably my favorite, which is all about discovering love while being blind to what it meant. And I think that's the problem, is that because it's so all over the place, I couldn't get into a rhythm of listening to this album. Every time I felt like, okay, we're going to start to go a little heavier now. Then we moved to something acoustic. And then once we got through the acoustic track, we went to this like funky beat. And when we went to the funky beat, then we're back to some heavier stuff. And that all over nature just doesn't always work for me. And it didn't here for Capstan. I mean, I like Capstan. I really enjoyed seeing them live. They put on a hell of a show. But this album just didn't work for me. I think it was also too long. It was just one that, unfortunately, I didn't have that connection to. It's a fine album. It's just one that I didn't connect with. I think overall it's a 7 out of 10. For me, I think if you're a Capstan fan, you might have a little bit of a different response to it. Or maybe I just read it wrong. But for me, it was not one of my favorites. It's probably not one that I'm going to go back to. So go check out The Mosaic by Capstan and let me know what you guys think. And the last album, or EP in this case, that we're going to talk about is All That I Have Left by Archers. This is Archer's 3rd EP, and I had heard some of these before, but this deserved a full review because I don't think I've really discussed Archers on the pod at all. And Say This Sober has been a favorite of mine since it came out because there's a line in there that really kind of strikes a chord, and it is, when things get heavier, that's when I disappear. And I think it's just something that we can look at and say, we all have these mental battles and we all have these battles within ourselves. And unfortunately, sometimes when things get heavier around us, that's when we disappear or when we shut down and we don't respond well to things. I'm guilty of it. I'm sure everybody else is guilty of it. And so Say This Sober is one that really kind of stood out. And I think the other thing that I wanted to point out about this EP is that the flow of these tracks makes them that much better, and it makes these tracks very catchy. I think that's one of the things that I didn't expect coming out of a band, is that these tracks are all very catchy. You can find yourself singing along with them, and they can definitely be ones that I'll see, potentially at a show in the future where people are already singing along, even if they don't know the band, 1 or 2 verses in, and you're going to know this song because of how catchy it is. And oddly enough, I don't know that I have personally a connection or for fans of this band, but when I went to their Spotify page and I looked at what they compared themselves to, oddly enough, I agree. And it's hard because they compare themselves a little bit to Sleep Token, a little bit to Dayseeker, and That's a hard comparison to draw, right? Like, that is not an easy thing. You have Sleep Token, who is the biggest band in the world right now, potentially. And then you have Dayseeker, who is just an absolute giant in the scene with one of the best vocalists potentially the scene has ever seen in Rory. And I got to agree. I mean, I think Archers kind of is that light version of those two bands right now. And I think as they continue to grow and continue to put out more music, I think people are going to start to recognize that, like, yeah, Archers are a force to be reckoned with. And I really enjoyed this EP, and I can't wait to see what else they have in store. So 4.5 out of 5 for me for this EP. It was a really, really good time. If you haven't checked it out yet, go check out All That I Have from Archers. That wraps it up for our reviews today, but I want to mention one more thing about an album that I listened to. It's not getting a full review because of my rules, and that is the acoustic album from Dayseeker that just came out. I have never been a big acoustic album person. When I started this podcast, I said that I wasn't going to do full reviews of acoustics or greatest hits or things like that or cover albums. God damn, that Dayseeker album's good, though. That's one of those albums that really made me question my rule set. And I was like, fuck, maybe I should talk about this a little bit. And I think it's worth it, because I think when you get an all acoustic album from a band in the scene, you don't really know what to expect. And I don't think any band can just pull it and do it. I don't think you could pull any band out of the scene and say, okay, make an acoustic album of some of your top songs and do a cover of a song and it work. But I think Dayseeker was the perfect choice for that. And I think Dayseeker made the perfect choice in the songs that they picked and the cover that they picked. That cover of My Immortal is stunning. That's the only word that I have. Rory's vocals on it make it so beautiful, and it's a song that really just has stood the test of time. I think everybody that's been involved in the scene that's, even been scene adjacent. I mean, My Immortal was a huge track even on the regular charts when I was growing up. I knew who Evanescence was well before I was even into scene music and even knew what scene music was, thanks to songs like My Immortal and Back to Life. And Rory really put his own spin on it and made it something just as special as the original version. And that's hard to do with a cover, especially a cover that's so well loved like My Immortal is. But I did want to mention that album because I have had such a good time listening to that, and for some reason, man, I have been playing the hell out of Sleep Talk. I don't know what in the hell has gotten into me with Sleep Talk, but that might end up being in my top 5 tracks in Spotify at the end of the year, and I never would have thought it. But Dayseeker did such a good job with song selection. I think it's the perfect way to potentially look at their next album cycle. I think we all are ready for more Dayseeker music. We obviously got the collaboration there with Rain City Drive, which was awesome. And I know they're going on tour in the fall. Yes, I got my tickets already for that, so don't worry. I'll be reviewing that show for you guys. But really impressed with that Dayseeker acoustic album. If you haven't heard it yet, go check it out. It's well worth your time. And speaking of shows, the last thing I want to talk about is 2 shows that I was able to catch on tour. And it was, the first one was the Black Tour with Imminence, Catch Your Breath, and Of Virtue. So Of Virtue started everything off, and they were amazing. I know that they were in my top albums last year, and it was kind of strange that they were, right? Like, I didn't talk too much about it on the pod. I didn't really keep mentioning it, but as I kept listening to that album, I just kept coming back to it, and it was incredible. And Of Virtue live is incredible as well. They're very interactive with the crowd. I even think I saw the lead singer during the Imminence set actually jump in the crowd and start moshing with everybody. That was awesome, but they were awesome. Catch Your Breath was a huge standout, and I think that really just re-solidified my thought process that Catch Your Breath is really poised for a superstardom blast into the stratosphere. They sound amazing live. Their songs are connecting with people. Whenever they put out their next single, I think that is going to be the start of them really just taking over the scene and taking over this alt-rock metalcore scene. But speaking of taking over scenes, let's talk about Imminence for a second. This show that Imminence put on was nothing short of spectacular. Quite honestly, it might have been the best show that I've ever been to. They have so much firepower between Eddie's vocals and then the violin, and then just the production that they're putting into their shows. I mean, I did this in a standing room only venue, and everybody was going nuts to this. I mean, everybody was headbanging. Everybody was so into it. And I've been to shows where that hasn't been the case, even with bigger name bands. I mean, that just happens from time to time. But goddamn, Imminence was one that when they were done, I didn't want them to be done. I wanted it to keep going. And seeing some of the songs from the Black live really just reinforced my 10 out of 10 rating for it that I gave it earlier this year. Death by 1,000 Cuts is still an all-time favorite for me. If you get the chance to see Imminence live, please take that chance. Please do it, because I got my ticket for, I think, $40, and I can almost guarantee that that's not going to be the case next time they're around in the U.S. because they were that good. I think they are Sleep Token level good, and it's just kind of waiting for that moment from them that's going to let everybody else recognize what we have already seen, and that they are the next big thing. So if you have a chance, go check out Imminence, Catch Your Breath, and Of Virtue on tour. I think the Black tour at this point is over, but when I'm saying go check them out, I'm saying go check them all out individually, even if they're headliners. They are well worth it. And then the second tour that I saw was Can't Swim, Belmont, Capstan, and Mean Sea. So Mean Sea is a local band down here in Maryland that opened up for them. Good time. Have no complaints about them. I think they were one that just kind of got added to the show. They weren't necessarily going to be on any other tour dates, but they did a great job opening up. Capstan was the second opener, and they were great. I loved Capstan. I loved everything that they did, and that's why I had such high hopes for that album, but Capstan was a great time live. Belmont came out as the opener right before Can't Swim, and Belmont had that place jumping. I have never witnessed a opener garner that much attention, garner that much energy from a crowd, and then also have a decent amount of the crowd leave after they're done before the headliner even comes on. And that was kind of strange to me, but Belmont rocked it out. And then Can't Swim came on, and Can't Swim was a fun time, man. I was really impressed with that. They were the surprise of the year for me last year. I was not expecting to like the album, not expecting to really connect with that band as much as I did. But they really came out swinging last year, and then to be able to see them live this year was awesome. They were a good time. If you get a chance to see them on tour, please go do it. Any of those bands were well worth the price of admission, and you won't be disappointed with any of those bands. That wraps it up for us here on part 1 of the Matrix Music Review podcast. I hope you all enjoyed. Links are in the description. 5-star review on Spotify, Apple Music. Share the podcast with a friend, family, whoever. I think I covered all the bases. I'm not going to talk too much more. My voice is about to die, but stay tuned for part 2 where we get with Bring Me the Horizon and some of the other albums that I've reviewed in the past week. I will see you guys then.